everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to today's program, which is the U.S. launch of our 16th issue of One Issue, Two Voices. This one is entitled Barriers to Cross-Border Labor Mobility, Professionals Doing Business in Canada and the United States. My name is Andrew Finn. I'm the associate at the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. David Biette, our director, sends his regrets. He's not able to be here. He's in Canada right now. Just give you some brief background on the Wilson Center and the Canada Institute. The Canada Institute works to increase awareness and knowledge about Canada and U.S.-Canadian relations among U.S. policymakers and opinion leaders. We work on three primary areas: border security, trade, and energy and the environment. Just a little background on the Wilson Center itself. Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars was founded in 1968 by an act of Congress and is the official memorial to the 28th president. He is the only president with a PhD. The center, we bridge between the worlds of academia and public policy by fostering independent research, open dialogue, and actionable ideas as we tackle the nation's problems and challenges. Canada and the United States form the largest bilateral trading relationship in the world. With the movement of goods and services important to this partnership, our panel is here today to discuss the significant impediments to cross-border labor mobility, which hinders trade and makes North America less competitive. First, before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. Today's program is being filmed and live webcast, so if you do have a question or comment for one of the speakers, please wait for a microphone so we can make sure it gets picked up. Also, the emergency exits are just out here and to the left behind the bathroom, so if anything happens, that's where those are. And also a small plug for upcoming events we have. On June 19th at 2 p.m., right upstairs in this building, we'll have a program on the TPP. It's a Wilson Center-wide initiative. Trans-Pacific Partnership, with our Latin America program, the Mexico Institute, Program on America Global Economy, the Asia Institute, and our Kissinger Institute on China, as well as the Canada Institute. Now, let me introduce Daniel Luzzo, and he'll take it up from here. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Andy. I'm Dan Luzzo of counsel of Dickinson Wright, a law firm headquartered in Detroit, Michigan. I'm actually operating out of our Columbus and Washington D.C. offices. It's great to be back here at the Wilson Center. I feel a little bit like a proud uncle or big brother. Andy was one of my former law students at Case Western Reserve. I warned Andy, I don't know, it was a long time ago now, when he said, came to me as a first-year law student and said I wanted to get involved in Canada-U.S. I'm taking this internship working on the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. I cautioned him, Canada-U.S. can be a little bit like Hotel California. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never really get out of it, and that's, that's the case in point today. It's wonderful to be here where there's a number of familiar faces. It's great to see some of you that were usually on conference calls together. I think it's Canada Day in Washington. There's a number of activities going on throughout the day on the Canada-U.S. front and on the multilateral front. It's also good to see some new faces today. Canada-U.S. can be a little bit like singing in the shower at times. We sound good when we're all together, but it's great to get some interesting perspectives from other disciplines, other walks of life. It's a privilege to be here today with our two panelists. I'll share my bias at the outset, and that there is not a day that goes by on the front lines of Canada, on the Canada-U.S. relationship, where this issue labor mobility is not front and center. As I mentioned, I work in the Canada-U.S. world, not taking anything away from our friends in the Pacific Northwest and the Atlantic region and elsewhere, but really the heart of the Canada-U.S. relationship. And we were sharing earlier with a number of our companies, automotives, clients, et cetera, it's the daily grind of moving goods and services and people across the border. A good day is usually when one of your clients calls and says, I got a good one for you. I got something interesting for you. Interesting is relative. But as I said, we were talking earlier, that my day often begins with a phone call from a small and medium-sized enterprise that says, you know, we were just trying to get our manager to go across the border to do some training, or we were trying to get our team over to service a product that we had sold across the border, and you know, we didn't really realize we were working in another country until today. It's very common to hear that in the Canada-U.S. world, and that's how the day starts in private law practice. As Andy's an alum, as well as Steve Dier that's here, I managed at Canada-U.S. Law Institute. I wish I could tell you it was because we studied the Google Analytics that when you type Canada-U.S. immigration, our organization came up first. It was really just dumb luck. I don't know why it happened, but we would get a phone call every day on a situation like that with employees stuck at the border, managers stuck at the border. Frequently it's the CEO, and that's of course when the company starts getting interested in compliance issues and employment relocation issues, et cetera. And of course, I worked for the Canadian government for about 7 years at our consulate in Detroit. I assure you that there is somebody on the phone right now dealing with somebody stuck at the border, an employee stuck at the border. There's also somebody on the phone probably with somebody that was trying to cross because they had a DUI. That's a very common occurrence that you get stuck with. So this issue, perhaps bar none, while Keystone XL and the Wilson Center has been very active, our little bridge between Detroit and Windsor are often front page news, that certainly labor mobility really is the underpinning today. And I don't think that you could hear from anybody better this morning than our two speakers. We'll start, each will present for about 15 minutes, followed by some moderated Q&A. That'll give you some time to think of your questions, and don't hesitate to throw some zingers. They're prepared. They've done this already in Toronto, so they're armed and ready. And our first speaker is Stephen Krein, who's the president of the Canadian Employee Relocation Council. Stephen, CIRC is the organization that represents the largest organization in employee relocation issues in Canada. Of course, being an organization of that size, engages frequently with public policymakers and the government world in terms of issues relating to labor mobility, barriers to mobility and employee issues. Stephen has both extensive private sector and public sector experience. In the private sector, a number of years working in the automotive industry, as well as in the Ontario government, has the scars to show it, I think, and in many ways has been doing this for a while now and can certainly share his views. And if you haven't read the materials, I encourage you. It is just fact-driven and demonstrates the experience and expertise that we'll see. Our second speaker is Lynn Shotwell, the Executive Director of the American Council on International Personnel. Lynn started there as the legal counsel on government relations, doing government relations. She is a frequent speaker, advocating before a number of organizations and public policy bodies, including down on the Hill, the UN, the OECD, World Bank, et cetera. Likewise, comes from the automobile industry with Oldsmobile. And near and dear to our hearts, she has a BA from Michigan State University and earned her JD from that. I'm a Buckeye, so we can't say the name of that school in Ann Arbor, but in Ann Arbor, and certainly is one of the leading experts in this field. So with that, we'll turn it over to Stephen, followed by Lynn. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us this morning. It's a great pleasure to present some of the work that we've done around the issues and the barriers to cross-border mobility. I'd like to sincerely thank the Canada Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion and for their publication, One Issue, Two Voices. It's encouraging to see an institution such as yours take on a subject like this. It gives us a lot more support and strengthens the positions that we are trying to promote in the business communities in both countries and with both of our governments. So we're delighted that we have had the opportunity to contribute to this. And I'd also like to thank Lynn Shotwell. We began this exercise back in January of this year, and Andrew Udell for your work on the American side of pulling all of the numbers together. But it's been a long time since I've been in school, and it was quite daunting to, when I got the phone call, would we write the essay? And I said, yes, of course, that's not a problem at all. And then they said, well, it's about 3,500 words. We'd like you to submit about 5,000, and then we'll work it through from there. So it was quite an undertaking, and of course all of the footnotes and all of the references had to be precisely checked, which made it for a much greater task than what we perhaps originally contemplated. So a little bit of background about some of the Canadian facts, just to put it in perspective, and our organization. We are an association that works exclusively in the area of workforce mobility. CERC was established in 1982, so we've been around for just over 30 years. We're very much structured similar to Worldwide ERC, which is based here in Washington, D.C. So in fact, at the time, the founders of our organization took that same model in establishing CERC. So we do a lot of research, we do a lot of education around the factors around mobility and enabling companies to better move their staff. And within that portfolio of services that we offer, we also have a very active government relations mandate. And our organizations, our organization is comprised of those companies in Canada that are based in Canada predominantly that represent our Fortune 100 companies. So the gas and oil industry, financial institutions, our large banks, insurance companies, large manufacturers, and so on. But our sole purpose, our sole focus is really on the issue of mobility. How do we get people back and forth between Canada and other jurisdictions, and also within Canada? We have a lot of challenges in moving people within Canada, which is subject for another day. But within the Canadian population, we have a workforce of around 17.3, 17.4 million people. We have an unemployment rate, a national unemployment rate, that's hovering between 7 and 7.5%. Some of the provinces, Ontario, for example, it's around 7.8%. It's a little higher than the national average. And the unemployment rate fluctuates between our provinces and territories. Now, in a number of the provinces, the unemployment rate is as low as 4.5%. And those are predominantly in the western provinces. British Columbia is on the Pacific coast, and of course it's a very large province, and their unemployment rate is around just around 7%. So it's just at or just slightly below the national average. Where the challenge comes in, though, is and Canada's a huge country geographically, and so the challenges of our country are very much dictated by our population and our population growth. And it's just estimated that within our workforce, in order to promote growth in our economy and also through our population, the only real solution to that will be immigration, because our natural birth rates are below the replacement rate. And that's posing a number of issues when one looks at social services, retirement pension benefits, and those kinds of things that we simply do not have the same ratio, or will not have the same ratio of active working people to retirees. And that is not something that is 20 years from now. It is 4, 5, 6 years from now. So this is really an emerging issue for Canada. And in terms of our movement between Canada and the U.S., about 70,000 people emigrate into America on an annual basis. Now, they may be for a period of a year or 2 years, but that's the natural flow. And it's estimated that there are about 1 million Americans permanently in the U.S. In a typical year, of that 70-odd thousand, almost 2/3 of them will be employed in management positions, and over 50% of them, over 50% of the Canadians that reside in the U.S. have a university degree or higher. So that's a little bit of a framework in terms of Canada and the context. One of the challenges from the business community is that we don't have all of the skills available to us that we need. And many of the organizations that I represent here today, have operations on both sides of the border. And so, one of the opportunities that we see, or one of the ways in which our members try to operate their businesses, is to move that talent as quickly as possible across the Canada-U.S. border as we can. And that is not without its challenges, as we've written in the paper that we produced. For several years, we've lobbied the Canadian government to engage with the Americans on ways in which we can improve the NAFTA. The TN list, there's a working group to find that was struck under the NAFTA agreement to find ways to improve the movement of business travelers between Canada and the U.S. But we really were not meeting with very much success in that area because there was really no appetite on the U.S. side to engage in that discussion. We also used our relations with other business groups in the U.S. to raise the profile of the issue. This included groups such as the National Foreign Trade Council, Worldwide ERC, and most recently with Lynn's group, ACIP. So we were very pleased when we saw the announcement from President Obama and Prime Minister Harper when they jointly announced their plans in February of 2011 to improve security while accelerating the legitimate flow of people, goods, and services between our two countries. I think, one of the things that, in terms of giving you that context as well, the security issue in the U.S. is far greater, demands far greater attention than it does in Canada. We simply don't, we did not go through the same situation that you went through with 9/11. We did not have that reality that ripped the nation apart. And that is a significant difference when we talk about the relations between our two countries. In the words of John Manley, who was he was actually the chair of the North American Competitiveness Council between 2002 and 2006. But he spoke at our conference in 2005. John Manley was a former minister in our government, and he's now the CEO of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. But I always remember him saying this at our conference in 2005 in Niagara Falls, just across from the border. And he said, it's like in the U.S., the difference between Canada and the U.S. is that 9/11 it never happened in Canada. And that is, that's a significant difference when we have these discussions. And the challenges that we try to find and the ways in which we try to find, balancing that way in which we can get people back and forth while preserving the security issues. And I hope one of the things that you take from the paper is that we are not trying to mix the two issues. We see them as two separately and distinct issues. This is not, the recommendations that we have made are not meant to undo or take away any of the emphasis that is needed in the area of security for both countries, because it is a significant concern. So in 2011, we surveyed our members that have cross-border mobility. We wanted to gain a deeper understanding of the challenges and the issues that they face. And that survey was later repeated in early 2012 with ACIP. And we used the results of that survey. There were in total, I think there were about 110 or 120 companies that gave us a lot of very good feedback that then went into some of the proposals that we had made. We worked with ERC for several months. We also took the work of the survey. We tried to craft a coalition of employer groups between the U.S. and Canada, the North American Manufacturers Association, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, ourselves, ACIP. There were about 12 groups that participated in this, and so we submitted a joint letter to both governments outlining a number of recommendations. And from that work, on December the 7th, 2011, the governments of both countries issued their action plan, which has now been called Beyond the Border. And that, we were pleased to see that action plan did include a number of initiatives that were important to the business community. on both sides of the border. One of the most important, I think, although, we didn't get some of the substantive kinds of changes that we were looking to see. But one of the good, I think one of the most progressive changes in that was better training of officers at ports of entry. And you'll read in the article, I'm sure, that one of the biggest challenges for business in both countries is uncertainty. Business, we might not like the rules sometimes, but at least if we know what the rules are and that they're clear, then we can figure out ways in which, how do we work with those rules? What are the things that we need to do? The challenges of the current system is that the rules vary. And as we've said in the article, and one of the things that resonates with me from what our members say is that, it depends on the time of day, the port of entry, what the officer had for breakfast that morning, whether or not you're actually going to get in, because, all of the circumstances are different. So very difficult challenge there. And while we've yet to see the true impact of that training, we're hopeful that it will make a positive difference when business travelers are presenting themselves at the port of entry. One of the key recommendations was the review of the trade NAFTA TN list. This was not addressed in the action plan. We are hoping that there will be some discussions around that. In the course of our negotiation, or in the course of our consultations with the Department of Homeland Security and Citizenship and Immigration Canada in 2012, we met with Assistant Secretary of DHS David Heyman and our Minister of Immigration Jason Kenney, and we broached the subject of a trusted employer program. And based on the reception that we received from both governments, we began the work of the development of what has now become the TEP, trusted employer model that would be acceptable to both governments. Lynn and her colleagues at ACIP were key allies in that endeavor, and ACIP had indeed worked on such an idea in the past. So we worked very closely together with Lynn and other professionals, Lyndon Melmed with Barry Eppelman and Layden in DC, and Alan Dina. I see Alan's with us in the back of the room. Alan is with Baker and McKenzie in Toronto. And so this small group were the architects of the idea of a model of employer pre-clearance, which was fashioned on other models that are used for the movement of goods between Canada and the US. So we were trying to take that model and say, okay, what are the things that we can learn from that, and what can we replicate? So essentially, within that program, just very quickly, and then I'll finish up, employers would be able to participate in the program. They would be required to sign a declaration that employees that were being transferred or entering as temporary business visitors would have the requisite skills and education for entry into Canada or the US. And we listed out the visas and so on that would be covered by that. The report in December 2012, the update to the action plan, the status report, did not contain measures to address this recommendation, although I am told that the report that is to be issued in June may indeed have a reference to a program of trusted employer. So we'll see what happens in that discussion. This is an interesting and exciting time, I think, for the business community in Canada and the US, because there is also another initiative that is underway, and that is not to be overlooked, and that is that Canada and the US are participating in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, which includes several other countries, including Mexico, Australia, Chile, Peru, and I think at last count there were 12 countries. Darren, is it 12? Yes, 12 countries in all. I think that number is probably changing as we go forward. And it's quite envisioned that those discussions will encompass rules governing temporary entry and the movement of skilled and professional workers. So from the business community, this presents a very real opportunity to lobby our respective governments about the need to facilitate more open mobility in our two countries. Now, there's been some discussions in the business community about, what's the starting point of those types of negotiations. So is our starting point, as we enter into negotiations in this arena, is our starting point to have what some people call a negative list, which says that, if these occupations are on this list, then they would not be permitted free open access? Or are we better to state those occupations that we would like to see on the list, and let's call that a NAFTA plus list for the purposes of our discussion this morning, which could expand and include on many of the occupations that are currently there. The advantage of a negative list and more open list is that it does not require ongoing updating. The situations around cartoon animators and video game producers and things like that were never contemplated back when the NAFTA list was initially published. I don't know whether anybody's been following the recent technology developments around the 3D printers, but just imagine what new technology is opening up in that sphere, and the requirements around employment that will flow from some of those things. So there's a lot of things to consider, but the one thing is for sure, and that is when it comes to labor mobility, the status quo cannot be an option. And this, as I said, is a great opportunity for the business community to engage and have some input into that. Just on a final point, while I was getting myself all tucked in for the night last night, of course, lo and behold, our government in Canada produces regulations amending our immigration and refugee regulations, and this is in regards to our temporary foreign worker programs. Let me just quickly say, without having had a lot of opportunity to plow through this document, but it really gives our government officials more authority to search premises, to gather records and information from companies that are employing temporary foreign workers. Those of you who may have been following this file will know that in Canada we have recently significantly tightened up the rules and regulations around temporary foreign workers. There are significant concerns in the business community around that, and we can probably take some questions and talk about that in the Q&A. I've gone on for far too long, and thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Now, Lynn?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to first start out by thanking Andrew and the Wilson Center for having me here today. And Dan, as you mentioned, kind of the Buckeye-Wolverine rivalry, but as we're talking about borders, it made me think back to my history class in 7th grade, and where I learned there was actually a 3-day war between Michigan and Ohio over the border. And I think a pig was killed. So, and I lived in Ohio at the time, so I was taught that Ohio won, but now I'm not so sure about that. We'll have to go back and look. So, yes, you got Toledo, yes. So, anyways, I'm very delighted to be here and talk about this issue. And when the Wilson Institute first asked us to draft this kind of point-counterpoint on the U.S.-Canada border, I thought, what are we going to write about? Because Steve and I agree on everything. We've been surveying our companies. They're both experiencing problems going in both directions. It's the same problems. We agree on the same solutions. So what will we talk about? And I thank Andrew Udell for doing some research to find things that we could talk about, and to really ferret out some of the different challenges Americans are having going into Canada versus the Canadians coming this way. So if I can start kind of on a personal note, I grew up on the U.S.-Canada border. My family's from Port Huron, Michigan, and so my view of a border was a very integrated community. Yeah, we had to cross the bridge, and you did a little stop when you got to the other side, but there was never a problem crossing to we used to go to Cosmos Pizza and to Chinese food regularly, because in the 1970s there was no Chinese food in Port Huron, Michigan. And as I got older, I started to realize that there was a difference between the two, because I could drink in Canada at age 19, and I couldn't do that in where I was from until 21. So I started to realize there was a border, but none of this really, it wasn't apparent that it was a big deal. There was regular flow of commerce back and forth. It was very easy to cross. I mean, all of that really did change on September 11th. I mean, since that time, when I've gone back to visit, I can sit in my uncle's backyard and look across the river at Canada and talk to my kids about it, but we generally can't go there because I forget to pack the passports. I mean, that's a huge change, and I think and it's unfortunate that our communities are no longer as free and as integrated as they used to be. So for the last 20 years, I've lived here in Washington and worked with the American Council on International Personnel. And ACIP is a trade association, and our members are the in-house legal and human resource and mobility professionals who are responsible for making sure that when companies are transferring their employees around the globe, that they're remaining in compliance. We focus primarily on immigration law, but certainly as you're transferring people around the globe, you've got to think about at what point do you begin incurring tax liabilities in other countries? What are other employment law issues that may be arising that you're not thinking about? So it's, last week we had our annual conference, and we spent 3.5 days talking just about high-skilled employment-based immigration. You can't even cover all the topics in that period of time because these issues have become so complicated and so complex. Our members spend, we did a survey recently, and on average, our members spend $1.5 million a year just on immigration compliance. I mean, so it's really, it's something they take very seriously, and it's unfortunately becoming more and more challenging rather than easier. And I think this is tough for a lot of these companies to understand because although many of I have members from around the world, but a lot of them, regardless of kind of where they are, if they're American in origin or German, they are considering themselves global companies, and they're developing their kind of business strategies and their talent management strategies on a global basis. So when they're looking to figure out who's the best person for a project, they're looking globally and saying, how do we put this team together? Who's the best person that we already have who has the skills that we need? And let's just transfer them. So, and they think that it should be just about as easy to transfer somebody from Canada, certainly Canada to the U.S., but the U.S. to India or China, as it is to move from between Michigan and Ohio. So this is the mindset of these companies that we're dealing with. And I think that what they're looking at is, to the extent that countries are facilitating the ability to move their personnel, that's where they're putting facilities. 20 years ago, I think the immigration teams didn't really have a seat around the corporate table. CEOs were not that aware of immigration or mobility provisions. Even CHROs, the Chief Human Resource Officers, rarely got involved in these issues. But today, what I get calls from my members all the time saying, look, my company's trying to decide whether we're going to open a facility in Ireland, the UK, or in the US. What do you think is going to happen with their immigration laws? Are they going to change? Because in 5 years from now, when we open this facility, are we going to be able to transfer the people that we need? So this is, I think, just a growing area for us. So as Steve and I point out in our papers, I mean, really the issue for companies at the end of the day is they need efficiency at the border. They can't wait weeks to get somebody across when a product they've sold breaks down and needs to be serviced. They need to be able to get people across efficiently and predictably. I think the most frustrating thing for our members is to have a situation where they send employees to the border. On paper, everything is identical. One person gets in and one doesn't. And this really, again, it really gloms up business operations. And when companies are operating kind of on just-in-time delivery methods, whether it's in the service industry or in the manufacturing industry, they really have very little kind of patience for bureaucratic delays or for laws like the TN list that haven't kept up with their business practices. And so while they do their best to comply, I also know that sometimes they push the envelope because they need to get business done, and they need to find a way to do it. And sometimes, for example, the TN list doesn't always accommodate some of the new positions they have, so they do their best to squeeze it into what's there. into the laws that are there, but it's not always easy. So, last week when my members were here, it was a great opportunity for me to talk to them and say, a year ago we surveyed you on the challenges you're having at the U.S.-Canada border. In the past year, the governments have made efforts to implement some of the steps in the Beyond the Border initiative, particularly the pre-adjudication of petitions. And I said, how's it working? Is it working better? And I think overall, the answer was, it's a little better, but it's not really that different. They're really not seeing a great impact at this point in time. Now, the strike by the Canadian Foreign Service officers hadn't been announced during our conference last week, so my guess is that this week, as appointments for visas are canceled, I think we're going to be hearing about that quite a bit, because certainly this will, the strike will delay the issuance of visas, and will make it much more difficult for employers doing business across the borders. One of the things I did hear over and over again is that there's a great inconsistency among the ports of entries along the border. And so what I heard is, well, Toronto's really a problem. It's very difficult to get people in through Toronto, so we just, we fly them out to Vancouver, because it's cheaper to fly them out to Vancouver, where it's easier to get somebody across the border than it is to take a chance in Toronto. So companies are spending a lot of money really trying to figure out, again, how to be efficient. And they're not trying to cheat the system, but they are looking for some predictability. One of the other things we talked about was the pre-adjudication of business visas. One of the recommendations that was made in the Beyond the Border initiative was to allow companies to submit paperwork in advance. And this had been the case in Canada even before the initiative, but in the U.S. that was a new step. And so companies can submit paperwork to the immigration officials to say, and get an answer on it before they transfer people in. But the challenge there is, in what I heard over and over, is it takes weeks, and sometimes that's just too long to wait to get somebody a visa. So I think the steps in the Beyond the Border initiative are good ones, but I think we're not completely seeing the results yet. Another issue that came up last week, and this happened about a month or two ago, is that the Canadian government has closed consular offices in cities across the U.S. So now the only consular offices, I believe, are in Los Angeles and New York City. We no longer have one in Washington, Buffalo, Seattle, Detroit. So again, I don't know if this is at all related to the Foreign Service officer strike, the fact that those consulates might be overworked now, I don't know, but it's causing great delays for our members. And where this impacts the most, most Americans going to Canada actually don't need a visa, so they don't have to visit the consular office. But what happens is American companies may have third country nationals, so they'll have French employees, Indian employees, others who are in the United States, and let's say they need to go on a business trip. They're going to have a trip to multiple countries. They need to renew their U.S. visa stamp before they're allowed back into the United States. And there's been a practice for many years of what you could do is you could get them a visa into Canada, send them to the U.S. consulate in Toronto, they'd get their U.S. stamp, they'd come back, do their business trip, and they'd be able to easily get back into the U.S. And the reason you'd send them to Canada is because it's generally, the U.S. consulates in Canada process things much more quickly than, say, the consulates in India or the consulates in China. You can just get an appointment much more quickly. So the closure of the Canadian offices and the visa strike are probably going to impact third country national employees of American companies more than kind of the American employees. And I think these are some of the things we don't think about with the complexity. At the end of the day, what the American company cares about is they have an employee, they need to have this employee working, and the system is not working for them. It's become much more complex. So we're keeping a close eye on that, and we're trying to, again, help companies figure out what's a solution that gets them the visas they need, and in a timely and efficient manner. Now, Steve mentioned that last night Canada issued pages of new regulations. I find it actually very interesting how quickly the Canadian government can get regulations out, and I'm not sure that's a good thing, because we're still trying to figure out the impact of two different changes in the law or in their regulations that took effect last month. So last month, two different things happened. One was that because of concerns about outsourcing of jobs, companies can no longer take advantage of accelerated labor market opinions. And basically, labor market opinions are when a company says, we've tested the labor market, we can't find a Canadian for the job, so you can now get a visa for your employee. So the accelerated path, was good for companies who knew in advance that they're doing recruiting all the time. They know that they need this talent and these skills. They can't find enough Canadians to do it, so they could get these opinions much more quickly. That's no longer the case. And so, again, we're waiting to see kind of what's the fallout of that. Is that going to add a month to visa processing time? Will it add 2 or 3 months? And I think we just don't know yet. But again, our members are trying to scramble and go back and predict their needs out as far into the future as they can so that they have plenty of lead time to get the visas that they need. The other provision that took effect last month is that children over the age of 18 will now be unable to accompany their parents on assignment in Canada unless they enroll in school. And again, this is a big problem for if you think about a multinational manager or executive that's moving the entire family. I think sometimes we work under the assumption that everybody's kids go to college or they're enrolled in college, but think about if you had a 20-year-old who's not in college. For whatever reason. Now they're no longer going to be able to accompany the family to Canada on assignment. And so generally what that means for a company is that employee refuses the assignment. They say, I can't break up my family. We're going to have to stay here. And again, this is something, it's new. Most of my members actually were not aware of it last week when we talked about it at the conference. So we're going to have to wait and see what the impact really is. So, I know the purpose of today is really to talk about the Beyond the Border initiative and the U.S.-Canada border, but I think we can't talk about these issues without really also considering the little debate that's starting in the Senate today on comprehensive immigration reform. I think it's very, very difficult on the U.S. side for us to really do anything on immigration, on border initiatives, until we resolve the whole issue of illegal migration that's in our country. So in a nutshell, I mean, the things that the bill that the Senate's starting debate on today will do, 4 things. It will legalize the up to 11 million undocumented persons who are in the United States. It will tighten the border. It puts, $6.5 billion worth of fences and drones and other technology on the border, primarily on the southern border, but there are some of this also will go to the northern border. And then it reforms our legal immigration system, providing, more green cards, new paths for workers, particularly in the low-skilled area, to come into the country. So, and then the final thing it does is it imposes or enhances the employer sanctions that requirements on U.S. employers. So when you're hiring, all employers will now have to use an electronic system to verify that the person that they're hiring is legally able to work in the United States. Overall, I mean, I think these are good provisions, but I think one of the things we'll be watching closely over the next week is what additional border security measures will be proposed as amendments and accepted in the Senate debate. In the bill that's currently pending, Customs and Border Protection is authorized to hire an additional 3,500 Border Patrol officials by the end of 2017, and they're given more flexibility to kind of reassign guards between the northern and the southern borders. One of the other provisions that is in there is that there's additional training is required for the Border Patrol, and it establishes some liaison committees with the border communities, so that there's more, again, because these communities are so economically integrated. I think it's important that we continue to find ways to keep the flow of commerce going and the flow of people and families, frankly, across the borders. The bill also, interestingly enough, would enhance the ability of the U.S. Trade Representative to negotiate trade agreements or to negotiate mobility and immigration provisions within trade agreements. This has been a point of contention among the Congress and in USTR. I mean, Congress really controls the immigration provisions, and they've been reluctant to allow USTR to negotiate too many mobility provisions in our free trade agreements. We have very limited provisions. For example, in the free trade agreements with Chile and Singapore, it started out that those were going to mirror the NAFTA provisions, and then we ended up with something a little bit different because Congress was reluctant to just kind of allow unlimited amounts of migration, even if it was high-skilled migration. So I think it'll be interesting to see how these provisions, play out during this debate, and then, kind of where we end up. I think one of the interesting things about watching this debate is that there continues to be an acknowledgement that we have a special relationship with Canada. And the senators from the border states, particularly Senator Leahy, are very conscious of this and have introduced amendments that basically say, we shall never build a fence along the U.S.-Canada border. We also are prohibited, or the Senate bill would prohibit us from imposing any kind of biometric entry-exit requirements along land ports of entry along the northern border. We can have them at the airports, but they said, it just would slow commerce too much to have any kind of biometric requirement along the northern border. They also, Senator Leahy also ensured that there would not be any fees for crossing the U.S.-Canada border. So I think, again, we're acknowledging our special relationship. I hope we can protect that. But we'll have to see kind of where we end up with the debate in the Senate. The one thing I'm disappointed in is that in the Senate is that we don't yet have a provision to require Department of Homeland Security to implement some sort of a trusted employer program. And what we're thinking of along these lines is, we have a trusted shipper program where it was implemented, I think, in 2003. It started with 7 employers who were kind of pre-cleared because they could prove to the government that they had security measures in place to secure their containers at the port of origin, so that those containers didn't need to be inspected when they reached the U.S. border because you have a secure supply chain. We also have the trusted traveler programs, which are the fast lanes at the ports of entry. And if you haven't enrolled yet in Global Entry, which CBP runs, but this is you get pre-cleared and you give your biometric. It's fabulous. You can speed through the airport security lines, but also when you're coming back from overseas, you can go through that line, and it saves a lot of time and effort. But the government knows who you are, so they pre-clear you. And so with our Trusted Employer program, we want to see the same thing. There are some employers that do lots and lots of cross-border business. The government knows who they are. They can show that they have programs in place to ensure that they're complying with the law. And we think that there needs to be some sort of a different track or a different path to kind of speed these employers through. And part of that is because within the U.S., as we deal with legalization, we have 11 million more applications coming into the system. Plus, we have a new green card system. We have all of those new applications flowing in. We have got to find a way to work much more efficiently, particularly when we're living in an era of sequestration and continued budget cuts. So we're hoping the House actually has a provision that would require the development of a trusted employer program, and we're hoping to see the same in the Senate. So, I think once we get past immigration reform legislation, I hope then that more attention can be turned to the Beyond the Border initiative, and that we can also start to look more closely at some of the mobility provisions in the transatlantic, the TPP, and also the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the U.S. and the EU that's just beginning. And we hope there'll be mobility provisions in all of those as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Lynn. I don't actually know how much time we have left. We'll wait for Andy to get back. But I wanted to start it off. It's funny, and thinking of your comments, you can see I was scribbling, and each one of you kind of hit some of the things we were talking about. But I want to come to the 3 T's, I guess. It didn't dawn on me when I was reading these, but the TN visa, the TEP, and then the TPP. and look at each one in isolation for a moment. But before doing so, I think, Lynn, you hit I can never remember if it's the elephant in the room, the gorilla in the room, there's something in a china shop, the big animal that is here, which of course is the immigration issue on the Hill. And whenever we have these issues in the Canada-U.S. front, there's always some basic education that needs to be done. And whether it's when we start talking about protectionism or Buy America, understanding that you're not hurting a Canadian company or you're not trying to give a benefit, it's actually a U.S. company that's being hurt because they're sourcing from Canada or something in that way. I wanted to take a step back because in each of your reports, or in the sum report, you spent some time at the beginning setting the stage for the argument, and Stephen did this in his comments, which two things come out in this world, which are the speed at which decisions need to be made in the global employee environment. I don't think that's something that's fully appreciated by folks that aren't there, just how fast these decisions need to be made. And you mentioned it could take weeks. Well, there are folks in the world who say if it takes weeks to process, it takes weeks to process. The other part is the demand for talent. Yeah, I think in the heartland, if you will, and Joe Lunchbucket or Jacques Lunchbucket, the view is we'll just hire an American or just hire a Canadian. I just wanted to just start off, if you could put that into some perspective, because that is part of the discussion being had down the Hill, framing that a bit and just what is the reality on the ground in terms of the demand for talent and pulling that from outside sources, as well as the speed in which these decisions need to be made, to put that into some context before we get into the nuts and bolts of some of this. Whoever wants to start.
So, I mean, I think it's a great question, and it's one we get a lot, particularly with unemployment remaining persistently high, of why can't you just hire an American for these jobs? And I don't have the exact statistics here, but there have been several recent surveys of CEOs, and PricewaterhouseCoopers just did a survey of CEOs, and their number one challenge that they're predicting is finding the skills and the talent that they need. Over 2/3 of the CEOs listed this as one of their big challenges, particularly as they look ahead and see the retirement of the baby boomers, and the fact that we are just not educating enough kids with the science, the engineering, the math skills that we need. Even at American universities, half of the graduates with advanced degrees in the STEM fields are foreign nationals. So you have an American company recruiting at an American university, and this is the pool of graduates they have. One of my members is a large oil and gas firm, and they said there were 7 PhDs issued last year in a particular type of petroleum engineering. Every single person was a foreign national. So this is the pool of who they're recruiting from. So I think that's one of the things. I think what we look at, ACIP is an affiliate of the Society for Human Resource Management, and we're trying to figure out how to tackle this skills gap. And certainly immigration's a small piece of it, but we're also working with companies to figure out how do you make sure that our K-12 education system is producing the talent that we need down the road. Some companies are partnering with local colleges and universities to create training programs to develop the skills that they need, the particular technical skills that they need. So I think there's a lot of activity in this area, but immigration is certainly a piece of it. I mean, and the other piece is that we live in a global economy. And so in many cases, it's not the job that the person's coming to do, the intercompany transfer, it's just they're following their portfolio. So, for example, if you have somebody who's doing an audit, so you have a major multinational accounting firm that's auditing a major multinational grocery chain, you don't want to hire a new person every time they go and audit the records in a different location. You put together a team made up of people from multiple countries, and they go around the world and they audit they audit their client in all those locations. So it's a new way of doing business, or not so new, but it's definitely a different way of doing business than we had 50 years ago, or even in 1990, the last time our immigration laws were really written.
I think one of the ways in which our world has changed so much, and we always think about supply chains as being physical pieces, but today it's not. It's intellect, it's creativity, and it's knowledge, and we need to be able to move those people around as much as we possibly can. business, I'll just talk about the Canada-U.S. border. We see, from the business perspective, it's there, but it's not really from a business perspective. We know that we've got to go through a lot of hoops and so on, but business wants to see that immediate movement back and forth as quickly as possible with, as Lynn said, the predictability and the efficiency of the border. I mean, and I'll come back to the question in a minute, but one thing that, when we talk about these programs like Trusted Employer, pre-clearance, most of the cases that are adjudicated, they're legitimate and they pass. So let's put more emphasis on catching those situations where, and we can do that through back audits and things like that, but let's take away some of those requirements at the front end without disrupting the security issue. But let's find ways in which we can make the passage of people much more predictable and much more efficient. Just in answer to the question that you posed, and it really is a good one because it goes really to the heart of why this issue is important. This is not just an issue for North America. This is a global situation, and many of the world's developing and developed nations are facing critical challenges when it comes to their working populations. One of the biggest challenges facing China is its demographic situation in the next 10 to 15 years. The McKinsey Institute did a study that was released last October, and in that report, and I think I reference it in my piece, in that report, they predict that there will be a global shortage of approximately 42 million skilled workers. And there will be an oversupply of low-skilled workers. I can't remember the number off my head, but it equates to about 15% of the workforce that will be in the low-skilled area. So we have this huge transition that's going on in developed nations and emerging nations, where we're moving from low-skilled kinds of occupations where all of the countries are moving up the food chain, and so we need highly skilled people. Within that cohort of 42 million, or roughly, let's say 40 million people, roughly, China will face the largest high-skilled gap of about 23 million people. The balance will be, the 18 million or so, the balance of that will be in North America and the EU. Now, just to put that in context as it is today, there are 24 million people unemployed in the EU, but there are 6 million jobs that they can't fill because they do not have the skills in order to do so. So the challenge is, can you train all of those people up? No. Can you get them to move to locations where the work actually is? No. One of the levers, if you will, or one of the tools that are available to employers must be available to employers is how do we utilize that talent? How are we able to move that supply chain of personnel as quickly and seamlessly as we possibly can?
That's amazing. Just Andy, real quick check. How are we on time?
About half hour.
Oh, okay, great. Turning to those T questions, I think the view in the piece as well as in your comments is that the updating of the TN provisions in the NAFTA probably ain't going to happen, to be blunt. The other part is a comment that each of you touched on. I just had the opportunity to be in beautiful Youngstown, Ohio, which is now the home of Utica Shale, but it's also the home of the federally funded National Additive Manufacturing Institute. So 3D printing, the additive 3D printing conference, the major ones in Pittsburgh as we speak right now. The reality is that even if we wanted to update that list, I don't think we have any idea what the employment world is going to look like in 5 to 6 years. But if you could just take a moment, is there any movement on TN updating the current framework that we have at NAFTA? Do you see it worth spending? I mean, obviously you can't say we got to pull out of our working groups, but is it better to just say that is what it is and we need a new model? Or I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but where do you think we are on the traditional framework? I think traditional is used a few times in the piece, which is usually code word for that's the old way of doing it. But where do you see that happening or going?
So I think the challenge with the NAFTA list is that it's a list, right? And so we've obviously identified occupations today that we need, that are not on the list, that we're having challenges with, but you're right, we can't identify what's down the road. So I think the better approach, and one that the U.S. Took, for example, in the free trade agreements with Chile and Singapore, is to just, limit it by either skill level. Say, if you have the equivalent of a bachelor's degree or above, you're generally allowed to come in, at least for temporary entry purposes. And I think that's really where most of the trade agreements will go. I think the one thing, though, that the trade agreements haven't done that they should be doing is really working on figuring out some of the things like harmonizing definitions. So we talk about intercompany transfers. Who qualifies as an intercompany transfer pretty much is the same in the U.S. and Canada, but it's not necessarily the same in other countries. So one of the things we'd like to see as we enter in, particularly into the multilateral trade agreements, is harmonizing the definitions of who's an intercompany transfer, who's a business visitor. And so business visitors, this is when you're traveling across the border. You're just going for a short time. You're going to attend a conference. You're going to attend meetings. You're going to maybe meet with potential clients. What's really one of the sessions that we had last week that was overflow for us was, how do you manage your international business travelers? Because, think about a large company that has 60,000 employees, and they may have, or 160,000 employees, and they may have 20,000 people on assignment at any given time across borders. How do you manage that none of them are doing work that they're not supposed to be doing? And the classic case in the United States is that a tailor can come in and take measurements for pants, but he can't cut the cloth. So start thinking about that in kind of the high-tech area. If you're coming in, can you, and you're meeting with a client, can you go back to your hotel room and you've got their specs. You go in, you meet with your client, you get the specs for the computer program that you're writing. Can you go back to your hotel room that night and start writing that code? I mean, under I think a very strict reading, the answer would be no. But how do you monitor that? Or think about a manager. We were talking about this last night. You have a manager who sits in Toronto. He has a sales team in Canada, a sales team in the United States. When he comes in to meet with his team in the United States, is he working? Is he doing the activities of a business visitor? Is he working? So I think these are some of the things that we need to kind of come to grips with in these multilateral agreements to make it easier and more transparent for companies, and to make the rules consistent. Because I think one of the most difficult things for my members in the immigration team is to go out and tell their managers, yes, when you go to Canada, you're allowed to do X, Y, and Z, but when you go to the UK, you can only do X and Y. And they're like, what are you talking about? Why is it so difficult? So I think that's a great untapped potential. I also think there's a great opportunity for us, again, within these agreements, to do more to streamline processes. We're still processing immigration applications like we did, back when people got off boats. We're looking at every application, and most of the time we're looking at pieces of paper. Companies are submitting stacks of information. Multinational companies are submitting their annual report thousands of times a year. We've got to find a much more efficient and fast way to do this, particularly because, one of the things that I think it could help with is fraud. Last week, one of my members was talking about that somebody got a hold of a stack of their letterhead, and it's their very secure letterhead, watermarked everything. They're selling it on the streets of India, and they're taking these letters into the consulates and saying, I should get a visa. Now, when the letters are written in very broken English and not signed by somebody who normally signs all of these, the consulates are giving them calls and saying, hey, are you really petitioning for this person? But I think if we could establish more secure ways where, for example, with the Trusted Employer Program, the company could say, only, these 5 people are authorized to sign these letters. So if you see something that's not signed by one of those people, maybe you want to give us a call because, maybe it's legitimate, maybe it's not. And so I think there are a lot of things like that governments could come together and do together. I think, again, some of these things are happening in other areas. I think in customs we're creating much greater partnerships so that, if Canada clears or inspects goods, we're confident that we can accept that. So I think there are things models that we can build upon in the whole area of mobility, because I had somebody say to me, they said, look, we're kind of in the area of managing mobility back where we were in managing trade after World War II. I mean, we're just in the infancy of trying to figure out how to deal with these issues. But they're not going away, and we've got to find a way to grapple with them.
Yeah, I guess quickly in terms of what do we do? Gee, I wish I knew the answer to that, because I think you've got to try and keep some pressure up in all of those arenas. Let's through the Beyond the Border initiative and the action plan, let's keep that moving forward. Let's keep the discussions going in that area. As I said earlier in my remarks, I think there's some great opportunities within the TPP. There's a good model that exists between Quebec and France. Premier Charest at the time, they negotiated an arrangement between France and Quebec that I always liked the way that Jean Charest said it, was that if you can fix a pipe in Paris, then you can fix a pipe in Montreal. And so, let's recognize those professions or those skills, and that's what they did. They've set out, I think at last count, the list was about 28 professions where there's reciprocity between the two. But I think Lynn is quite right in that, there's a great opportunity to figure out how do we harmonize those definitions, particularly with those countries that we do a lot of trade with, or that we might say are friendly trading partners, and let's make it easier for us to get people back and forth. So those would be a few points, but I think we have to keep the discussion going in all of these areas, and because of that, I know that takes energy from the business community, but within those groups, we've got a lot of the officials that are trading ideas and talking, and so if we get a little bit of headway in one of those areas, we can maybe push it in another.
I think we've hit both the first T and the last T in those comments. I like the Quebec, France example. Others have mentioned Australia and New Zealand is often a model cited in this area and others as well. And I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll open it up to the broader audience, but it has to do with the TEP. And next week, a number of us will be here for the B2B RCC meetings, stakeholder meetings. That was a lot of alphabet soup in that sentence. But the few folks in the room and some of us were involved in the Trusted Traveler programs and the creation of those a while ago. The result has been, I think, Lynn, you cited that it was a handful of companies, Kevin Smith at GM and others, that were doing these things. And the result was the hope at the time was that this was going to expedite travel and speed it up. The problem is, we always tell the joke that we can sit there with our Nexus card in the Detroit-Windsor tunnel, when we're stuck an hour and a half behind. It doesn't help you. So if infrastructure didn't match, but what you're looking at more on the trusted employment setting isn't so much the speed of movement as we're seeing what's FAST and CTPAT and others. It's the certainty element. The other side of that, however, is that where CTPAT, FAST, and FAST or CTPAT in particular, PIP in Canada, it's really become a safety valve, where it's not so much that you're getting any enhanced benefit in terms of processing, or in some matter certainty. What you're getting is, God forbid we ever have a situation where the border shuts down, we know you're going to be first in line. It's a safety measure. It's a leveraging attempt. I'm just wondering how you see the TEP working in practice. Is it, and to add on that, I guess I've kind of preempted that in saying the certainty, but the other aspect of it is when we were doing enhanced driver's license, we knew that if you got Michigan, Washington State, and New York State, you had about 80% of the states that you needed. So do you see the TEP working well for a handful of your respective members? If you knock out some of the large companies, we can deal with the small and medium-sized guys later. I mean, how would this work in practice? I mean, what's the effect? I don't think any of us are real happy with what happened in the Trusted Shipper programs. They're there, they were expensive. Certain companies could do it because they could make the capital investments, but others can't, you know, and it's not solving the problems for them. So with that, I guess that's more of an opinion than a question. But if you can maybe comment on how you see this working in practice.
Well, that's actually interesting with the trusted shipper, because I think what we've heard about it is that it actually has helped. So I'd love to hear more. And I guess my understanding is that there are up to 10,000 companies that are now enrolled. So I think what we envision is this. I don't think we don't envision that trusted employer is just for large companies. I think it needs any company, a smaller, mid-sized, that is doing enough kind of travel back and forth across the border that it's worth their time to kind of, I think, jump through some extra hoops on the front end. So, you know, so they would submit information, go through some clearance procedures on the front end, so that, again, then when they send their employees to the border, there's more certainty. I think one of the big differences between trusted shipper and what we're talking about, obviously, is that, you know, goods don't kind of walk away from the dock on their own. And so we can never move, you know, when we're dealing with people moving back and forth, we always need to leave discretion at the border for the officers to make the decision of this person just isn't admissible for some reason, right? Either it's because of a security threat or because they really don't have, you know, we don't think that they really intend to go back home when they say they do. I mean, there has to be that discretion, but I think there are a lot of kind of things we can get out of the way with pre-clearance. One of that is, you know, is the company a legitimate company? I mean, that really doesn't change from day to day. Is the job they're coming in to do the type of job that's allowed under the immigration laws? I mean, those things can be taken out of the system or out of the kind of the decision-making rubric, so there's more certainty. And then you have, you know, you'll always have the decision on the individual person. We can never completely eliminate that, but you can have more certainty on some of those issues. And I agree. I think, you know, trusted shipper, none of these programs are perfect, but I also feel that if we don't try new things, we're never going to advance, because, you know, we can always find reasons not to try to move in a new direction, but then we're stuck with what we have, and we know that what we have doesn't work very well.
I think, no, Lynn's covered it.
No, I think that's a great point. And it's one of
Thank
the
you.
regrets that we have is, I think, we didn't manage expectations properly on the trusted shippers. And as long as there's a recognition that that there's still going to be discretion and that there will still be randomness in the system. Our friends from USCBP, they're still going to do trunk inspections in a Nexus line. I mean, it's just going to happen, you know, and those types of things.
Yeah, we're not talking, just to be clear, again, just to reinforce that, we're not talking about undoing any of the security measures that are currently in place.
With that, are there any questions from the audience? Here we have a whole stack here that we haven't even got to the hard ones yet. But any questions? Yes. Either one. Go ahead.
What role do provincial governments play?
Excuse me. Can you wait for that? You can identify yourself as well.
Oh, I'm Leanne Poirier from the Quebec Government Office in Washington. What role do provincial governments in Canada play in the attempts to facilitate cross-border labor mobility?
That's a good question, and I don't have a very precise answer to that. I don't know whether the federal government has done any consultations with the provinces on Canada-U.S. mobility. There are restrictions within Canada on intra-provincial mobility between some of our provinces when it comes to recognition of skills and credentials. So there is there's the TILMA agreements between the provinces, and the Western provinces have come up with accords to do better recognition. There is the provincial nominee programs around the rules for recruitment of foreign workers, but I'm not sure that I'm not sure to what extent they've had input into beyond the border. There are some people from the Canadian government here that might be better equipped to answer that question for you after the session.
Loudly, but that's not going to do for the. I can talk loudly, but it's not going to do for the internet. We'll try the other one. Hi there.
Morning.
I'm Teresa Brown, Cardinal North Strategies. My question is about, you mentioned the global competition for talent. And as much as we like to talk a lot about the United States and Canada partnership, we're actually in competition with each other for that talent too. And during the immigration reform debates earlier, there was a lot made of Minister Kenney coming to California and talking about the opening of new avenues for skilled workers to come to Canada. He was accused of poaching by some. So how do you see that playing out in some of the cooperative things that we're trying to do?
That's a very good question. That's a loaded. That's a bit of a loaded question. I think the attempt was to announce the new entrepreneurs visa that had been announced, and companies and countries, jurisdictions are going to be doing this on an ongoing basis. And again, I think it comes back to our kind of motivation that says, we need companies to locate in the jurisdictions where we can make it easy to move people back and forth. Our governments will always be trying to find ways not only to attract capital and investment, but now, and this is, you've got a very important point there, because I don't know whether any of you have the opportunity to follow the world of the World Economic Forum, but Klaus Schwab is the chair of the WEF. And he said that, we've entered this new area of talentism. And so companies and countries are going to be finding ways in which they can provide the motivations in order to have people come and work in those locations, whether it's the development of, very cities that attract those highly talented and skilled people, whether it's better tax incentives. I think there's going to be a lot of emphasis on that. So I've not answered your question in terms of how do you balance that. And the truth is that, I think that companies and countries will try to find ways to do that. Yeah.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I don't know if anybody saw last week in the New York Times, they had a story about the new billboard that has been put up in Silicon Valley saying, got H-1B problems, again, come to Canada. And I think, yeah, you're playing at two different levels, and I think this is an issue that many countries are struggling with. We saw back when the economy was in better shape, we saw lots of countries opening up their temporary and their permanent immigration systems to attract skilled workers. And we've seen a contraction of that around the globe. Kind of as unemployment's risen, we've seen this contraction of it's more and more difficult to temporarily transfer either intercompany transfers or the H-1B equivalents, the skilled workers. At the same time, we are seeing many countries creating entrepreneur visas. Chile's done one of the most interesting things where not only will they give you a visa, but they'll give you capital to start up a small business. So it's an area of intense competition, but maybe the best way to temper that competition is through, agreements, and so that we level the playing field.
Yeah, and that, as I think about the work that I referred to John Manley earlier about creation, the North American Competitiveness Council, and they did a lot of work in this area about, the North America's ability to create that competitive corridor, if you will, where goods and people could move more freely, because we have to meet the challenge that's being put out there by countries such as India and China. And so how do we facilitate? We've got a very small pool, really. If you think about those numbers that I threw around earlier, we've got a very small pool of highly skilled people, and that's only going to get more challenging going forward. And so I think it behooves us as governments in our countries to find ways in which we can move those people back and forth. So I think this is really an important issue in this whole discussion.
Bridget.
It's always bad when they know my first name before I ask the question. Bridget Mathieson, Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. I was taken with the two questions prior as the panel was taken by those two questions, and it raised a thought to me, and I'm thinking out loud in front of a microphone. Dangerous. But what was the governor of California's response to those billboards? If Jerry Brown saw those billboards, or if Mr. Kenny saw those billboards in British Columbia, I would imagine that the first reaction is, oh my gosh, they're poaching, to use the word. But at second thought, wouldn't it inspire these people to say, we have a problem? And we can either dummy it down to the lowest common denominator and keep the conversation at national to national or multinational levels, and you know that that dummies down everything. We're talking about pipe fitters then. But where are the voices like the governors and the premiers and the mayors that, because all politics is local and job creation and job revenue is local, where are they here in Washington urging what you and the panel want? It's a thinking out loud comment. And my question to that is, has anyone given thought to regional rather than national to national? California, Oregon, Washington was the birthplace, as Teresa knows well, of a lot of our border reforms that gave birth to these trusted trader programs. That might be a ripe community. Great Lakes is another one, the Great Lakes region, Quebec and New England. So anyways, because the immigration reform bill is moving and it is going to be buried in baggage. So maybe small pockets of better conversation.
It just occurs to me that as you were talking there, that one of the things that we suggested as part of the Trusted Employer program, it was actually a Trusted Employer Pilot Program, TEPP, as opposed to TPPP. But it was, and what we were suggesting was that let's design a program that can kind of fly under the radar screen, if you will, for a period of time. And so I think your point is well taken. You know, like we would select a specific port of entry or a corridor and say, okay, let's focus on that. Let's put in some measures, and then let's learn from that. Let's, you know, this is a huge ground shift, right? So what are the things that we could put in place on a small scale, start to learn from them, build on that, build on the success of it, figure out where the problems are, adjust those, and learn. So, you know, maybe that's, you know, as I was saying earlier to your question about which ball do we keep in the air, so to speak, I think that there would still be an opportunity for us to consider this kind of a program on a pilot basis. So good question.
And I don't know what the governor's response was, but I hope it was the same as the business communities, which is to take that article and circulate it to members of Congress and say, this is why we need immigration reform. And the reason I'm actually hopeful that we will get comprehensive immigration reform this time around is that I think we have engaged governors and mayors and others in a way that we didn't have when we had this debate back in 2006 and 2007. Mayor Bloomberg has put together a coalition of CEOs and mayors and governors and others who've been pushing very hard to get Congress to pass immigration reform, and they've been particularly focused on the whole entrepreneur issue. I think in terms of the regional, I think it makes sense on one level, but on the other hand, I think the nightmare for a human resource professional would be dealing with 50 different state immigration laws. We started to go down that path when Congress failed to pass immigration reform in 2006. We started seeing states pass their own employment verification laws. So suddenly, companies that had operations in multiple states had different paperwork to fill out and different procedures they had to follow, and in some cases, different documents, depending on where they were hiring the person. So we're very much in favor of one federal uniform immigration law because I think it's just too difficult to administer otherwise. It's also the reason that, you know, I have mixed feelings on bilateral agreements. Bilateral agreements, I mean, they're easier to negotiate. So to the extent that we can open up mobility through bilateral agreements, that's a positive thing. But from a human resource manager's perspective, trying to figure out how you can move your employees and whether their spouses can work based upon what country they're from, it becomes very difficult. And so that's where we think, multilateral arrangements where, you can treat all your employees equally regardless of where they're from, is a much better approach. But I'm hopeful we can get, we should have an answer by the beginning of July in terms of whether immigration reform is still alive or dead here.
Boy, you are helpful.
I am.
We have time for one more question. If not, I think, go ahead, follow up? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Hold on, wait for the mic, Rich.
Yeah, but Lynn, you would agree, not to be argumentative, but you would agree that there's a difference between reform in national immigration law
Right.
for a permanent employee based in some country, some company in some country, U.S. or Canada, and what we were talking about earlier were these more temporary business travelers. And that's what I was getting to. I understand that larger immigration reform requires states and provinces, and everybody wants a national template rather than the Campbell soup version. But
Right.
the employee that's leaving to go on a business trip, a sales trip, an IT programming,
Right.
fixing the assembly line that's idling at $1 million an hour, if we can come up with a more rational approach for manufacturing supply chains, which really they follow along geographic lines or regional lines. That was what I was getting to.
No, I completely, I understand what you're saying, and I think it would be very difficult under the U.S. system to kind of develop something that was specific to certain regions or states, because although I think the opportunity there, again, is fixing the border. Fixing what happens at the ports of entry will have a geographic impact that's great. It will have obviously will impact the border communities much more greatly, but I think I don't foresee that we'll write into our laws that, that there's a preference given to people who are going to do business in a particular state. I mean, at one point there was a proposal, and I can't remember if it was for North Dakota or South Dakota, to create an H-1B visa just for that state. And there were lots of good reasons to do it, but it was just decided that was not a path, at least, that the U.S. wanted to go down. I know Canada's done some of that, where provinces have special programs to encourage immigration to particular places, but I just don't see the U.S. going down that path.
That was true, and that was the perfect ending point for this. I want to thank both of our speakers, Lynn and Stephen, for their comments. I think the phrase of the day was we have a post-World War II environment for the movement of people on the continent, if not the globe, and I think you have offered several suggestions, or myriad suggestions, for moving that into the 21st century, and I thank you for your comments today. And with that, I'll turn it back to Andy for the conclusion.
I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. If you please give a round for our panel and moderator today. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't also thank Stephanie McLuhan, who is our consultant in Toronto, who was instrumental in putting this publication together. So again, I want to thank Stephanie. Thank you again to all of you, and have a great day, and hope to see you on June 19th for our TPP program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thanks, Danny.
Interesting stuff. I'm curious to see it.